It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Can people hear me in the back? Otherwise, we can always use a mic. Okay, that's good. Okay, how much time do we have a day? I have a lot of material, so.
We technically should make a stop for tea.
Okay, sure.
And eventually eat.
Okay, sounds good. Eventually. I like the eventually. This is the eventual consistency, right? That eventually something happens.
If you can stop at 4
Okay.
for the break, and then we start again at 4:30.
4:30. Okay, sounds good. I'll plan. I'll try to pace myself that way, but you know, there's never enough time. I can always talk about memory systems forever. So, but we'll try not to do that. Can people see the screen here? Okay, that's good. So I'm going to talk about memory systems and memory-centric computing systems because that's how I would like to think about things going forward. We're going to cover a lot of interesting things, hopefully. I'll start with memory importance and trends. This is really divided into 5 parts, as you will see later on. This is the first major part of the tutorial, let's say. I will skip a bunch of things since we don't have a lot of time, but I think people know me, so I'm going to skip this one. I do research in computer architecture. If you're interested in reaching me, you can find me online. It's relatively easy. I'm actually interested in a lot of things, not just computer architecture, but systems, hardware security, and bioinformatics. In fact, I'm going to talk about bioinformatics to begin with in a little bit. And these are some of the things that we work on in my group. These are some of the current research focus areas where the definition of current is already stale. But we work on a lot of memory and storage, DRAM, flash, and emerging memory technologies, interconnects. You're going to hear a lot about that in this tutorial. We work a lot on hardware security, energy efficiency, fault tolerance, performance, and the interesting space we're in right now is, where we're trying to optimize all of them at the same time, and while we're having scaling problems. I'm going to motivate a lot of things that way in memory from the bottom up going forward. I think you mentioned that also, Alberto, earlier. System architecture interaction, new execution models, new interfaces. We're going to talk about that, especially within the context of processing in memory and heterogeneity. And clearly, heterogeneous and parallel systems are everywhere today, and they're going to grow and grow. How to take advantage of that, how to take advantage of GPUs better, and systems for data analytics. I also do work on genome sequence analysis and assembly, algorithms and architectures, and a little bit further out, biologically inspired systems and system design for biomedicine. I'm not going to talk about this last one, but I'm going to use this as a motivator for, as an example application for why we should really care about memory systems. By the way, feel free to ask questions. We're never going to cover everything I have because we don't have enough time. But you can enhance it by asking questions whenever you want to. And these are 4 key directions that we're following in my group. This is also a bit outdated, but I think the fundamentals are still there. Basically, how do we build fundamentally secure, reliable, and safe architectures? How do we build fundamentally energy efficient and more sustainable architectures? I think memory-centric comes from there, or more appropriately, data-centric probably. How do we build fundamentally low latency and predictable architectures? And the last one is architecture for genomics, medicine, and health. And as I promised, I'm going to start with this one over here. And I will also have one other advice. Whenever I give talks, I usually go over the slides relatively quickly, and slides may have a lot of material. You'll get better out of this if you actually don't pay too much attention to the slides themselves and don't try to read the slides too much, and instead listen to me and basically capture the key points in the slides. Because if you try to read some of the slides, you're not going to be able to do that. I can guarantee that, I think. Okay, so let's start with this one. I think I want to give a motivating detour on some of the work we're doing on genome sequence analysis as an example application that really, maybe an example platform also going into the future that's going to demand a lot more from our hardware as well as the memory and storage systems going forward. This was I'll start with the story also. This was, when I joined Microsoft Research to start the computer architecture group in 2006, I was thinking of what should the computing landscape look like going into the future. And I was also discussing with some of my friends who were in the genome sciences department at the University of Washington at that time. And this was an idea that just came to us while we were hiking on Mount Rainier, the beautiful Mount Rainier at that time. And we wanted to basically design an embedded device that could do genome sequence analysis in real time, let's say within a minute. And the idea is to have this device that's embedded, that you can give to a doctor or anyone, and they can sequence a genome and they can ask questions, basically. What kind of interactions do I have with this drug? Since everybody knows about coronavirus these days, what is the sequence of this coronavirus and what does it look like? And you want to do that in a minute, very quickly, so that you can take action very quickly. So there may be many applications of this. We didn't really think about the applications as much, but we thought that this would be very useful going into the future. Like, which of these DNAs does this DNA segment match with? What is the likely genetic disposition of this patient to this particular cure for this thing? And whatever else you can imagine. And clearly we know about genomes. Everybody has taken basic biology. I'm not going to go through this, but every genome consists of 4 of these bases, A, C, T, G. And these are real. There are a lot of stories. We don't have time for these stories, but this is actually a genome that's taken, DNA that's taken from Henrietta Lacks. It's known as HeLa. And this was taken against her consent, actually, from her. There are a lot of privacy issues here, but this enabled a lot of research into human genome. Anyway, so these things exist, they're real. So what can we do with it? Basically, we want to understand these things, and what those things are is they basically are a sequence of ACTGs in the DNA, right? That's our goal. Basically, we want to find the complete sequence so that we can understand. We can ask these questions to that complete sequence, right? But the challenge is there is no machine that exists today that takes this long DNA, long meaning 3.2 billion base pair long, let's say, and for humans, and gives the complete sequence as output. So there's no technology like this. If you actually come up with this technology, you're golden. Probably you'll make either a lot of money or you will contribute to science greatly. All sequencing machines are essentially choppers. They take DNA, they chop it into pieces. And they identify these relatively small pieces with some accuracy. But they do not tell you how they fit together. As a result, after you get the output of this machine, you have a computational problem. You have a computational puzzle. You want to put these things together. So I liken this to these yarn balls that your cat may play with. Basically, you have these yarn balls that are entangled with each other, and you cut through it with some scissors, and you cut through it in many different pieces. Eventually, you have small pieces of this yarn ball, and you want to reconstruct the yarn ball again. And real life is kind of like that, actually. When you take a sample from someone or somewhere, you will get a lot of DNA. You want to first disambiguate them, but also basically your chopper essentially gives you a bunch of mixes of even a single DNA, right? It's not there are also other DNAs, but I'm not even talking about that problem. I'm talking about the problem of taking one of these and actually chopping. And these are the choppers that we have. Reasonably up to date, not still out of date, but so when we first started dreaming, this is an interesting chopper. These were actually choppers that chop the DNA into relatively large, small pieces. That was the beginning of the high throughput sequencing technologies. Like you take a 3.2 billion base pair DNA and you chop it into 200 and 300 base pair length small pieces. And now you want to reconstruct the entire DNA again out of that. So these are actually very accurate. The 200 and 300 base pairs that they give you are very accurate, 99.9, more than 99.9 accuracy is good. But the other machines, this actually didn't exist when we were dreaming. This was introduced in 2014. So you can see that we're getting to the embedded domain. We were dreaming of it, and other people were working on it at that time. So it's good to always believe in technology. And this machine, you can buy it for $1,000, $2,000. Recently, people were using this, for example, to sequence viruses in Africa. I'm sure people are using it for coronavirus or somehow, because this is actually very efficient. What this gives you is a sequence of DNA, fragments of DNA that are a million base pair length long. So they're long, much better actually. But the error rate is very high. Error rate is about 10 to 15%. So computational puzzle is still there, basically. So you need to really amplify how many times you actually get a sample from a DNA, and you will need to use a lot of methods to reconstruct the DNA. Okay, I'm talking too much actually, since we don't have a lot of time. But I'm excited about this topic. So clearly, none of these machines are perfect, so they all lead to different computational demands in the end. And clearly, this is important. I don't need to tell you about this. And relatively recently, people have devised these machines because this is actually maybe the second revolution in genome sequence analysis. Basically, the cost of genome sequence analysis has been going down significantly. Initially, it was very costly because the machines were not there and we didn't have references, but now it's much less costly. You can see actually this curve plots the cost of sequencing versus cost of a transistor, which is essentially Moore's law. You can see that Moore's law is going this way. Cost of sequencing per raw megabytes is going down much more significantly. And this is where, when the high-throughput sequencing machines were introduced, and this is where nanopore technology was introduced also. You can see that technology actually makes a difference in the cost. Okay, so my point is, we know how to do this reasonably well today. We can always do better over here. But if you really want, so we can actually sequence a lot of genomes. A lot of countries are building a lot of genome sequencing centers for good or bad. They could be used for good or bad, like any technology. And they're generating a lot of sequences. But we're bottleneck computationally, basically. We want to basically somehow reconstruct the DNA first, and then ask questions to it, and then hopefully lead to scientific discovery or medical cures. But essentially, we're bottlenecked by the read mapping step. So there are multiple questions. I'm going to skip some of these. There are many, many questions you can ask, of course. So for example, if you have a virus at hand, if you have a bunch of these sequences, you can tell, these questions can tell you, the answers to the questions can tell you where they're the same and where they're different. And I like this example also. You're comparing many different species over here. I like this one even more, perhaps. I mean, within species, even though we may look extremely different or think extremely different, we're actually very, very similar, as you can see. But banana is a little bit different, as you can see. So you can do very, very interesting things. You can also figure out the genomically unknown organisms, at least the proximity in their different species clusters. So you can do a lot of things. But we're basically bottlenecked in mapping today. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, and this is actually relatively old also. But yeah, you can sequence at very high bandwidth with these machines, but the computational bottleneck is computational bandwidth is much lower. Even if you throw a lot of machines at it, because there are parts of these algorithms that are actually relatively irregular. And one of the steps in this analysis is actually the first step, I would say. One of the first steps is to reconstruct the entire genome from many reads. A read is what is produced by a machine, basically. It's 200 base pairs, let's say, or 1 million base pairs. So why is this is called as read mapping? Basically, the idea is to map many short DNA fragments, reads, to a known reference genome with some differences allowed. So this is the alignment problem also. If you don't have a known reference genome that you construct in some other way before, the problem is even harder. Basically, you first need to reconstruct the genome that you don't know of. And that's called assembly. Assembly and alignment actually are similar. Sometimes you do assembly by doing alignment to some different genomes. That's also possible. But I'm not going to go through assembly. So in terms of alignment, what is the problem? Pictorial, let's take a look at it. DNA logically looks like this. Physically, it looks like this. Physically, you chop it into pieces. You get these pieces. And you want to map these pieces to some reference genome. And you want to say, this piece matches here approximately, and this piece matches here, this piece matches here, and in the end, my DNA looks like this. Of course, if you have only one sample like this, you're going to have a lot of trouble. Normally what people do is take many samples and build confidence in terms of how the DNA actually looks like in the end. And today, even the human DNA, we don't know completely, actually. Around 80% of it we know very well, but the remaining 20% we don't know very well. Okay, so mapping these short reads, if the reads are short, mapping those to a reference genome is challenging. Assume that you have 50 to 300 base pair reads and the reference genome is 3.2 billion base pairs. You have a computational problem at hand. So how do you actually compare these things today? Basically, you have a read and you want to compare whether it matches the reference genome. One very simple algorithm is to actually take the read and basically stream it through all possible places in the reference genome and compare at every location. Okay, you could do it with a simple Hamming distance comparison, but that's not what we want actually. We want something much more sophisticated, and that makes actually things more complicated also. So that's not a good algorithm, by the way. That's not how mappers are built today, because that's extremely expensive. We'll talk about that briefly later on. But the comparison that you would like to do is more like what's called edit distance comparison. It's really the minimum number of edits. And edits could be insertions, deletions, or substitutions to the sample read that you have that are needed to make the read exactly match the reference segment. So I'll give a basic example. Probably people know about, how many people know about edit distance here? Okay. How many people know about Hamming distance? Okay. That's usually the case. Hamming distance wins over edit distance. And Hamming distance is easier to compute, of course. So if you take Netherlands versus Switzerland, this is the edit distance. Basically, let's assume that Switzerland is the reference, since we're in Switzerland. If you're in Netherlands, Netherlands could be the reference. The read is Netherlands. So you get this read Netherlands, and you want to compare it to Switzerland, and you want to find the minimum number of edits. Clearly, these two are mismatches. But you can realize, after a lot of effort, you can think about the computational complexity of it, that this is actually a deletion in Netherlands. There's a deletion in Netherlands before T, where I exists in Switzerland, so that you can make these T's match. And this is a match over here. And then after that, you have a mismatch, H and Z. And then after that, you have 5 matches in Netherlands. And at the end of Netherlands, you have an insertion that doesn't exist in Switzerland. Right? So basically, you can compute the edit distance. And this may be acceptable, because what you may be looking for is how close is Switzerland is to Netherlands, because this may be approximate species that are close to each other, right? And they are kind of, right? You have a significant number of matches between them. Okay, so what does it translate biologically? Clearly, this reference genome actually, this may be an important gene, and you may match that gene approximately, and that may have a biological meaning. I cannot tell you all the biological meaning, but people actually find out that these variants that are relatively local, that are close to each other, but they're not exactly the same, are very good indicators of disease, for example, or are very good indicators of potential treatment or response for a drug, for example. There's a lot of literature on this clearly at the higher levels. Okay, so what are the challenges? Basically, you want to find the many mappings of each read, because each read now doesn't match only a single place. Clearly, even in the beginning, it didn't match in a single place. With edit distance, it can match many, many possible locations in the reference genome. How can you find that efficiently? On top of this, you need to tolerate small variances and errors in each read, and there are multiple reasons for it, as we discussed. Subjects' DNA might differ slightly from the reference. How can we efficiently map each read with up to E errors present? E is very important, actually, because the biological meaning of E, people are still exploring it at the genetics level. But people, what I know is researchers really want to maximize E as much as possible, basically. If you can actually figure out, if you actually increase E, you will, of course, get things that are relatively different from each other, but you will also understand the meanings in terms of, for example, response to a drug much better. Okay. And also, you want to do this relatively fast, especially if you want to build something like what we envisioned. And as I said, human DNA is 3.2 billion base pairs long. You have millions to billions of reads, especially when you amplify, when you have many, many samples. So the question is, how do we design a much higher performance read mapper? I'm not going to answer all of these questions. That's the subject of another talk, and we still have not answered all of these questions clearly. We're doing research in this area. But I'm going to give you our story in it, and then tie it to an ending, let's say, to motivate the rest of the tutorial. Basically, when we first started looking into the problem, we said that we actually want to have all of these at the same time. And we worked with folks at University of Washington Genome Sciences Department, and this was our mapper. Now more people are using it. So this mapper is actually guaranteed to find old mappings, so that you don't miss anything when you actually compare, when you actually sequence a genome. And it can tolerate up to E errors. Of course, when E increases, this mapper actually becomes much, much slower. So if you're interested, you can download this mapper. It's not, I mean, we've improved the code, so I'm going to tell you some of the improvements briefly. But if you look at the execution time of breakdown of this mapper, it's actually, most of the time, it really spends on this Netherlands versus Switzerland edit distance comparisons. Most of the time, you do read alignment, edit distance comparisons. And basically, that's why you have this huge bottleneck. At least that's what we conjectured. So our idea was actually to get rid of these comparisons as much as possible. First at the software level, and then accelerate at the hardware level. And the idea is very simple. Build a 2-level mapper as opposed to have a single-level mapper. The first level is a filter. The second level is actually the part of the mapper that does the actual edit distance comparisons for those things that you really need to do those edit distance comparisons, where your filter tells you to do. And that's the basic idea. And then we set out to do multiple different types of filters. Again, I'm not going to bore you with these things. If you're really interested, you can read these papers, and you can actually download the source code and run these. It's all open. The idea over here is to take advantage of the structure of the human genome and how different parts, different reads are expected to align to each other when you're doing the search, actually. So that you can actually eliminate a lot of the edit distance comparisons that you have to do over here by taking advantage of the structure of the human genome and the distribution of different types of, let's say, character strings that you have in the reference genome. And this way, you can actually get rid of more than 99% of the comparisons. And you can speed up mapping by, let's say, 20x in this case, which is still not enough. Because we started out, let's say, when we were doing this in 2006, it was taking maybe more than 2 weeks to do the experiments that we had envisioned. If you speed it up by 20x, that's not enough for a minute or a second, let's say. Okay, then we actually looked at other things. Basically, if you have a filter like this, you can be intelligent about it, and you can actually come up with new metrics. We came up with something called shifted Hamming distance, and this is very SIMD friendly. Again, I'm not going to bore you with it. If we had more time, I'd be happy to talk about it. This speeds up the mapper by another 3x. And then we went into FPGAs, and then we built the first FPGA-based alignment filter. You can combine it with, so there was a lot of work on FPGA-based edit distance computation, which was very interesting. But if you actually, it's much more effective if you combine an FPGA-based filtering mechanism with an FPGA-based edit distance computation. That way you can actually accelerate both pieces, because you really don't want to do edit distance comparisons unnecessarily, I think. And that's the paper. If you're interested, you can take a look at it also. Actually, this is very interesting because now some of the companies like Illumina, I think they recently announced that they're building some of the sequencing, some of the sequencing inside the machines themselves. So they don't want to give you raw reads. They want to give you analyzed reads. And they actually have some FPGAs inside the machine to actually do the processing itself. So that was our vision to begin with, and hopefully, but they're not open, of course. You don't know what they do internally. And we have a bunch of accelerators that you may be interested in. And this is our latest one, actually, that was published that speeds up the mapper by another 4x. Okay, so why am I telling you all this? In the end, we've designed all the software and software-hardware co-designs. And if you actually optimize what we've done, and we try to optimize as best as possible, we found out that we're always heavily bottlenecked by data moment in this. So the gatekeeper FPGA performance is limited by DRAM bandwidth that we have there. That's true for the shifted Hamming distance when we actually utilize the SIMD units as much as possible. We're always bottlenecked by memory. And we have recently been exploring solutions to this also. Basically, we've been looking at processing in memory to alleviate the bottleneck, as opposed to moving the data to the computation units that are far away. Why don't we move the computation to where the data resides? And I'm going to talk about that in these lectures. However, of course, I mean, this is true whenever you're doing software-hardware co-design, but if you're doing processing in memory, you need to be even more cognizant about how you design the mapping and filtering algorithms, and you need to design them such that they can fit processing in memory. This will become a little bit more clear when we talk about different forms of processing in memory. But if you're interested in this, this is one of the more recent papers that we published talking about this, and this speeds up the mapper by another 4x, let's say. Although I don't believe that we've optimized it really well. I think the potential here is much higher going forward. Actually, a lot of genome analysis algorithms are moving into graph processing algorithms today also, because people are trying to represent genomes as graphs so that they can easily manipulate them. So there's an interesting convergence between graph processing and graph analytics and genome analysis today. Okay, so let me quickly talk about it. So there are two key principles we exploited in all of this work, and I basically summarized, I think, 6-7 years of work. Actually, more than 7 years, sorry, 12 years of work. We wanted to exploit the structure of the genome to minimize computation, and we wanted to morph and exploit the structure of the underlying hardware to maximize performance and efficiency. And the best gains are actually when you combine these ideas together. It's algorithm architecture co-design for DNA read mapping. And we found out that on average, you can speed up read mapping by about 300x, sometimes more. This may not incorporate our latest results. But still not enough, basically, because we want to get to the 1 minute or even less than 1 minute boundary. And the complexity of what you have actually increases with the data that you have, plus E. It increases with E, for sure. And it also increases with the questions that you want to ask. Okay, I'm going to skip this improves accuracy part, but that's... Okay, so this is even more exciting. When we first started, we were looking into these big machines. I think we have these small machines. I think big machines are very interesting also, but these small machines can enable a lot more impact because they can be anywhere, right? So we've been looking at this nanopore sequencing device, and it's actually a pipeline. When you how this works is, sorry, I don't know why this is moving. How this device works is, it basically I believe this was a true revolution actually in sequencing. What it works is that you have a nanoscale hole, and in this nanoscale hole you pass the DNA as a string, and while the DNA is passing through it, the ACTGs are passing through it, you basically sense the current. And the current readings correlate with ACTG, basically. Of course, it's not a very error-prone process, but you can get the current readings, match the ACTG accurately 80 to 90% of the time, let's say. It's not too bad. Yes?
How was the process in the big machine?
Say it again?
What was the process in the big sequencer? It's the same kind of technology?
Oh, no, it's a very different kind of technology. So basically, there are multiple different technologies over there. I don't want to go into the technology a lot, but some of them actually shine light, and basically they have photosensors, and you basically amplify the DNA, cut it into pieces, and basically send it to those photosensors, and the reactions that you get in those basically give you whether you have an ACTG. That's one of the mechanisms. Illumina uses that. That's why it's called Illumina, actually. It's photosensing, basically. But you can make it much more scalable this way if you have a nanoscale hole. But of course, the trade-off is this is less accurate in the end. But the DNA that you pass through it can be much longer, about 1 million base pairs. The problem with the photosensing technology, not just photosensing technology itself, but the whole flow itself was you have to cut DNA into really small pieces to get accuracy. Otherwise, the DNA breaks and you can actually not be able to send it to this photosensing. I hope that answers it. Yeah. This is not my expertise area. That's what I know about the technology itself. Okay, so this one is actually fascinating, I think, because it enables these long reads plus at high error rates. But you can actually clearly do it yourself. You can actually buy it. You can figure out how to do it yourself also. But this is actually interesting. Basically, you get this raw signal data. These are current measurements. First, you need to call the bases. So there's actually a lot of machine learning algorithms that are employed over here. You can see that deep nano is an example. You can guess. And then you find some read-to-read overlaps. There's a lot of graph processing algorithms over here. And then you form an assembly. And then you do the read mapping, which we've been talking about over here. So there are a bunch of different tools. It's a long pipeline of processing. And we've been talking about this read mapping so far. And nanopore is actually interesting because this paper that we wrote a couple of years ago analyzes the bottlenecks in the different parts of the pipeline and basically discusses where we should focus on. Base calling was a bottleneck. I think it's still a bottleneck, so these machine learning algorithms also need to be accelerated. I just want to give you the big picture. Read mapping was a huge bottleneck in those other devices, but when you go to these smaller devices, bottleneck may actually shift because because the accuracy is not very high. People actually try to do a lot of intensive software techniques or software hardware techniques to actually improve the accuracy as much as possible by designing better base callers, better overlap finders, and better polishing mechanisms. And that adds to all of the other parts of the pipeline as opposed to just focusing on read mapping. Even then, accuracy is still not high. Okay, so this is fascinating. Okay, let's go back. Basically, this was our dream 12 years ago. We want an embedded device that can perform comprehensive genome analysis in real time within a minute. I think we've come a long way, but we're really not there yet. We still have a long ways to go. I think energy efficiency is a key problem, especially if you're building this small device. Maybe it's not a big problem in the big devices, but I think if you put sustainability into it, then this becomes a problem. Actually, I was reading an article recently about Google's one of Google's models, and they were saying that it took, I don't know, 30 weeks to train or something like that. And somebody was doing the calculation in terms of how much energy is spent for training these models. So basically, these are hidden costs that we don't see, right? Maybe energy is not a problem. Google will probably tell you, oh, energy is not a problem in our data centers. But they're really actually taking a toll on the environment in terms of sustainability by doing these things. So energy is always a problem, in my opinion. Okay, performance is clearly a problem if you want to do it within a minute or so. And security, we haven't even touched it yet. So if you have this device and if it stores data and it's really important data for you, how do you handle security and privacy? So basically, I think in the end, there's a huge memory bottleneck. I believe these problems are actually coming from huge memory bottleneck and maybe unoptimized things. Security, in my opinion, actually can be solved with taking a fresh look at memory. I think a lot of the issues that we're seeing in terms of security, the meltdown and Spectre examples in hardware, are problems with memory in the end, right? Because you have this memory on your chip, and somebody actually can look at it in some way. So maybe there's a better way of designing systems such that that memory doesn't get exposed as much. Okay. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to talk about this more. I give talks about this also, and we keep doing research in this area. I find this fascinating. Any questions so far?
How much the device costs?
Which one? The nanopore? So it's about $1,000 to $2,000. Yes. So you can actually get it and do your experiments. I think that actually enabled a lot of people to do field experiments out in the world. Yes?
The pipeline that you showed is the goal to do every computation locally on the embedded device, or do you plan to perform some steps on large infrastructure or something like that?
Is it possible to do the computation you said in that embedded device over here?
No, I mean, do you plan to do everything locally? Or
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So I think we'd like to do as much as possible locally, for sure, because that minimizes the data moment. So what these folks are doing with this nanopore devices is they're doing nothing locally. What's happening is you can generate all of this data. Basically, they send all of this data to data centers across Europe, Asia, United States, and they're causing a huge churn of data moment. We'd like to minimize it as much as possible, but of course, some of the questions that you ask may not be possible to do locally, right? Especially if the data doesn't exist in the device, then you'll have to do something different. So we'd like to enable the possible ability to do it locally as much as possible. And I think your question was good because I wanted to also mention this. We have this data. So we talked about this energy efficiency and sustainability, right? And I think data moment is a big chunk of that energy efficiency and sustainability problem. And we're basically doing this at the macro scale. We're actually causing a lot of data moment at the macro scale today because of what I just said, because we don't have processing capability sometimes, or we're not using the processing capability. And in the micro scale, we're also causing a lot of data moment. When we talk about computation and memory, we're going to focus a lot on that micro scale. Micro scale meaning this thing clearly is doing some processing inside right now. You have memory and processor. And in that micro scale, it cannot do computation inside the memory. As a result, it's doing a lot of data moment at that micro scale. I think we would like to minimize that data moment as much as possible. Okay, so that's why I would like to focus on memory and storage. So let me actually, this is the first part of the lecture series, although I spent a lot of time on the first prologue part, so we may actually accelerate later on. So why is memory so important? I want to motivate things a little bit, and then this will also touch at a high level some of the directions that we're going to talk about in the remaining parts of the course. I'm going to motivate things from performance, energy, and scaling, reliability, security perspectives, and then we're going to talk about some trends, challenges, and opportunities. So we're going to focus a lot on main memory, which sits in between processors and storage. And this is a critical component of all computing systems. Basically, whatever you're building, you need to have some sort of working storage, which is really main memory. And going forward, I think main memory and storage is going to merge more and more with the emerging non-volatile memory technologies. And this system, main memory system, must scale in many dimensions if you want to maintain the performance growth and the technology scaling benefits that we've been used to for a long time. So it must scale in capacity, size, technology, efficiency, cost, management algorithms, power, a lot of things basically. And if you want, it doesn't matter what you attach to this main memory, processors, FPGAs, GPUs, or a heterogeneous combination of those, which is really happening over here, for example, you're bottlenecked by memory in the end. And this is my cartoonish picture. This is a very old picture that I drew in 2008, I think, for a proposal to the National Science Foundation in the United States. This picture still remains the same, unfortunately. Basically, what this picture shows with, of course, as a cartoon is you have a single node over here, and the processing units are the red parts over here that are called cores. Everything else is dedicated to moving and storing data. Caches, interconnects, memory controllers, other caches, memory controllers, other caches, other interconnects, other caches, storage in the end, right? Basically, if you do the calculation, more than 90% of a single node is dedicated to components that move and store data. Of course, you say maybe it's not more than 90, depends on what you look at. But if you look at cores, the processing units are a very small fraction of it. Most of it is really caches again, L1 caches, register files, interconnect the components. So more than 90%. And we call these computing devices. We should probably be calling them data storage and movement devices because they're not most of the resources are very small fraction of the resource dedicated to computing, right? So let me tell you the state of the main memory system that will lay the ground for the rest of this part. So there's some recent technology, architecture, and application trends that lead to some new requirements from the memory system and that exacerbate old requirements. And we've always demanded a lot from this system. We're going to demand even more going into the future. I will hopefully show you throughout this course that DRAM and memory controllers, as we know and design them today, are unlikely to satisfy all these requirements. They're already actually falling short in terms of satisfying these requirements. And at the same time, there are some emerging memory technologies that enable new opportunities, like merging of memory and storage. These are non-volatile memory technologies. I'm not going to talk, unfortunately, we don't have time to talk a lot about these technologies. I'm going to inject them at right times, but we're not going to have a long enough lecture, let's say, on emerging memory technologies. Although they're fascinating, I think, and it's good to look into them a lot. So given these, I think we need to rethink the memory system and to fix the issues we're having with DRAM and memory controllers and enable at least one of these emerging memory technologies. Although I believe the future is very bright over there also. It's always good to believe in technology, in my experience, and I believe that's true for the bigger, grander experience of centuries too. There will be some technologies that are coming up that are going to change things. Nanopore was one of them, but in the memory domain also, that's going to be true. And of course, we want to satisfy all these requirements. So basically, we need to rethink the main memory system and the systems that we're designing around the main memory system. Because the way I think about it, and hopefully this will become more clear, we have a problem with memory, and we've been designing the systems around this problem to basically avoid this problem as much as possible. Because we're not able to do some things in memory very well. Or, yeah, maybe we should change that going into the future. Okay, before we get to that, these are, in one slide, the major trends that are affecting main memory, again, in my opinion. But I'll give you some evidence from the field with that also. Basically, we want more memory capacity, memory bandwidth, and quality of service, and performance in general. So this first slide is really about performance in the end, and predictability. So why is this? Because computation is not a problem. We can put many more computation units than we need, in my opinion, or than we can sustain in a single chip today. Applications are increasingly data intensive, and we can consolidate more and more, or we want to consolidate more and more, especially if we want to get energy efficiency and area efficiency and building efficiency and power efficiency. So these are all driving capacity, bandwidth, and quality of service requirements up and up, and predictability requirements up on a single node and in general also. So this is one data point. This is actually from a paper that was published in ISCA in 2009 from HP Labs and University of Michigan. These folks basically analyzed the trends in terms of core count and memory capacity, DRAM capacity, and they basically found out that core count is increasing much faster than memory capacity. And they basically said memory capacity per core is expected to drop by 30% every 2 years. Of course, it's not good news for software because software actually relies on having more memory capacity per thread if you actually want to improve performance, right? Of course, unless you can parallelize things perfectly, right? So trends are actually much worse for memory bandwidth per core. I'm going to show you that in the next slide. So of course, take this with a grain of salt. Whenever you see pictures like this, it's always good to question, is the trend still continuing? I believe the trend is still continuing in GPUs, for example. In CPUs, I think people have realized that it doesn't make sense to actually put a lot of cores if you cannot provide a lot of memory bandwidth and capacity to them. And because memory bandwidth is actually limited much more, as we will see in a little bit. So maybe in CPUs, it's not growing as much. But if you look at the aggregate things that are connected to main memory, I believe that's, I didn't do that study, but I believe this trend is actually much worse than what is depicted over here. Because many things are connected in an SoC to memory today, like a video accelerator, audio accelerator, speech accelerator, machine learning accelerator. Everything goes through the DRAM. And usually you don't have multiple different DRAMs. You can have multiple different channels, but that's a different thing. Okay, so let's have some fun with trends in terms of DRAM capacity, bandwidth, and latency. So this is a picture, real data from the field, showing the improvement in DRAM relative to 1999 in a DRAM chip, in a single DRAM chip, a DDR chip. We looked at the commodity DRAM chip that's used most commonly. And we wanted to plot how much capacity has improved over the course of 18 years. Let me ask you a question. How much do you think capacity has improved in a single DRAM chip within this period? Any takers? There's no wrong answer. I'll take any answer. So DRAM chips are designed for capacity. So this should hopefully improve a lot.
Does it fit on this scale?
It fits in this, well, almost, yeah. It's closer to the higher end of the scale. So it's basically 128x. We're having difficulties recently, actually, but this is actually, I mean, you could call it Moore's law, although there's some capacitor over here. But we're following the trend reasonably well. We're having difficulties because we're cramming many more cells in a given area today, as we will see, and we will show you evidence. What about bandwidth? Not as good, that's right. That's a good answer. It's about 20x, basically. Again, capacity is how we design chips. Bandwidth is important in the considerations, but it's not as important, and it's not as easy to improve also, because in capacity, technology is usually on your side. And when you go to a smaller technology node from 40 to 30, naturally you have more things in the same area, right? But bandwidth, you need to think a little bit more. You need to change the interface, you need to clock things higher. But usually if you pay more, you'll get more bandwidth. What about latency? Okay, very bad. I like the very bad. Yeah, it's about 30% basically. It's reduced only by 30%, which I think is a bit sad because this exacerbates all the problems that we talked about basically. So we design processors to tolerate these huge latencies that we're not improving in the end. We're going to talk about latency toward the end of these lectures. I think it's fascinating to actually improve the latency without increasing cost. So, I mean, we could actually spend a day on this slide in particular, because there are a lot of interesting things to talk about. But the gist of it is, this is relatively easy. That's harder. But there's also a mindset problem that DRAM or storage in general is designed for high capacity and not for low latency. Low latency processors are designed for low latency. I think of this as a processor-centric worldview. Processors, latency is extremely important. Storage, memory, not so much. What is really king is capacity over there. And I think it's not just a difficulty problem, it's also a mindset problem. Okay, we'll get back to that mindset problem actually, because we could do relatively simple things to improve that latency a lot. But people have not done it because the mindset has not been there. Okay, so I shouldn't probably belabor this, but clearly main memory is critical for performance. There are many applications. There are many analyses that you can find. I'm going to talk about some of these later on. That shows that memory is a performance bottleneck. And sometimes it's the latency, sometimes it's the bandwidth, sometimes it's the capacity, sometimes it's the interesting combination of all of them in different parts of an application or different applications. And these you may consider maybe larger scale, but even the smaller scale, I don't want to call it the lower performance, because some of the highest performance systems go into these SoCs. Even the smaller scale, memory is a performance bottleneck. Okay, I guess I'll talk about this over here. But we knew this actually before also. This is a paper that was written by Dick Seitz, who was the chief architect of Alpha. How many people know about Alpha here? Okay, hopefully. Not a lot. So Alpha architecture was clearly, they designed some of the fastest processors. They were competing with Intel at the time. And Dick Seitz was the chief architect over there. After they designed the Alpha 164 processor, he wrote this article in Microprocessor Report. It's only one pager. I would recommend reading it. It's a beautiful paper, actually. It's only one page, again. You can read it right now. Well, maybe you can listen also. But basically, in this paper, he said that we designed this processor. It's capable of finishing 4 instructions per cycle. But on this important workload, actually it was a database workload, I think, it's finishing 1 instruction every 4.7 cycles. So it's operating at worse than 1/18th of its bandwidth, peak bandwidth. And he said basically why? It's waiting for data to come back. And he said basically, this is the ending sentence of that paper. I expect that over the coming decade, memory subsystem design will be the only in italics, important design issue for microprocessors. It's very bold. I wouldn't put only over there perhaps, but this gets the point across hopefully. But that's 1990s. In my PhD thesis, I worked on something called run-ahead execution, which is a processor-centric way of tolerating memory latencies. We did a similar study, except in many workloads. These are actually 147 workloads that Intel used to design its processors with. And we found something similar, basically. Most of the time, the processor is waiting for memory for the data to come back. It's doing, I don't want to call this useful work, because some of this is based on speculation. It's basically progressing. That's not a good term also, but basically it's not stalling for about 30% of the time. Some of it is actually wasted for speculation, clearly. I'm going to get back to that, actually, when we talk about latency. So if you don't believe Dick Seitz, you don't believe me, everybody believes Google. Maybe not in China, but most of the rest of the world believes in Google, for good or bad. They published this beautiful paper in ISCA in 2015, where they profiled their workloads microarchitecturally. They said this is all of their data center workloads in the paper. And they basically showed essentially the same thing. Most of the time, the processor is waiting for data to come back from memory. This is a state-of-the-art Intel processor, by the way. It's finishing instructions only 10 to 20% of the time. Okay. And they have a lot of good analysis, so I would recommend reading their paper if you're interested. So we're going to get back to this. So basically, performance is extremely important, but we're still waiting for memory, even though we actually have been optimizing performance for a long time. So maybe we're not designing some things right in the system. Okay, so that's performance. Now let's go into memory, energy and power. So energy and power is clearly a key system design concern today, and memory energy and power is increasing. This is very nice data from IBM in 2003. They basically examined their big iron servers at that time, and they basically showed that more than 40% of their entire system energy spent on the off-chip memory hierarchy. And at that time, in 2003, 2000s, early 2000s, off-chip memory hierarchy included off-chip caches, off-chip interconnect, off-chip storage, and DRAM. Okay, fast forward about 10 years or so. Similar folks, actually they overlap a little bit in the authorship, examined the power consumption in IBM Power 8. And they basically show that more than 40% of the entire system power is in DRAM. So over the course of 10 years, a lot of components got integrated on chip, DRAM remained off chip, and those interconnects became responsible for more than 40% of the powers themselves in the end. That's true for GPUs also, actually, and there are a lot of studies that show that this 40% is increasing going into the future. I'm not even talking about cost, actually. Cost is also another part over here that plays into energy and power in some way. Okay, so one of the other issues is DRAM consumes power even when it's not used. So this machine is right now refreshing its DRAM all the time, even though I'm not using it. So DRAM is in self-refresh mode. So it's not a great technology. And this is actually a scaling problem with DRAM because you need to periodically refresh it. In the end, how frequently you need to refresh it, it needs to be determined by someone. And determining that is becoming very, very difficult today. We will hopefully talk about that when we get to the reliability issues. Okay, so this is becoming worse. And this is a slide that I borrowed from Bill Daly. We're going to get back to this slide later on also. You can argue with these numbers because these are relatively old numbers. This is from his High Peak 2015 keynote. But basically, if you look at a 64-bit double precision floating point operation, it consumes about 20 picojoules. A DRAM read or write 16 nanojoules. It's 800x. Okay, if you stretch it a bit, 1,000x. If you look at the real numbers, it's actually about actually, I was in DAC in June, and people were actually talking about the number, the ratio over here. And I think some folks who were designing an AI accelerator, they actually compared the numbers, and they said that a DRAM access costs 160x the energy of a floating point multiply and accumulate in their AI accelerator. So we're somewhere between 100x to 1000x. I think 1000x is the highest, and you don't want to be there. But 100x is still quite a bit. So computation, this also goes back to computation is very cheap today, whereas memory access is not cheap in terms of energy. And again, we'll get back to this slide, hopefully, when we talk about computation and memory. But I think to jog your thinking right now, if you're adding two floating point numbers, and you don't have good locality, I'm not going to say even any locality, but in the extreme case, you don't have any locality. But you don't have good locality, let's say. Does it make sense to bring these two numbers by doing two memory accesses on chip and then do the addition, simple addition, very fast, very energy efficient, and then write back the result back with one memory access? Does it make sense to do three memory accesses for this simple addition right now? I don't think that's the answer. Actually, if you can do the calculations for the break-even point, how many times should you use and reuse an element to actually be even in terms of the energy cost that you're paying for moving that element into the chip? And you'll get to numbers like 100, 200, depending on, of course, the cost ratio, or 500 very quickly. And I don't know a lot of applications that use a lot of elements, especially the big data applications going forward, that use those elements that frequently.
How do you take those measurements?
Oh, that's a great question. How did they take? So I didn't take these measurements. This is from Bill Daly. So this is that's a good question. They have a paper on this, GPUs and the future of parallel computing. They don't talk about their methodology, but if you're designing a chip, you can get these measurements. Not so hard. So I think
physically they go on the chip and they get some electrodes.
No, that's not very easy to do. Unfortunately, I wish that were the case, but that's not what they do. Yeah, they model it usually somehow. So if you know what you can do. I mean, if you can go into detail on this, but one way you can do these things is really you can measure the power going into the chip, and then you can run different workloads and understand what parts of exercise, and then you can correlate how much power is spent in which parts, basically. Of course, it's not perfect in the end, but people have shown that you can get good correlations with these measurements. Now I think they have a lot more information than what I just said, so they can do much more with this. Okay, so we've actually, so in the end, I'm not going to go into the detail, but we're going to talk about this detail paper later on. We've shown that more than 60% of the entire system energy is spent on data movement on 4 important workloads that people normally use on their cell phones, for example. And these are workloads like TensorFlow, Chrome browser, in this case because we work with Google, and VP9 video encoder and decoder. Okay, so that's the energy cost. Now let's talk about scaling a little bit. On top of all of this, we're having problems with really important metrics. On top of all of this, DRAM technology scaling is ending. Basically, what is technology scaling? You reduce the size of a transistor or a component, let's say. In DRAM, as we will see, it consists of a transistor and a capacitor, and you keep reducing the size of it over generations. And you have a feature size associated with that. And ITRS, International Technology Roadmap of Semiconductors, has been projecting for a long time that DRAM feature size will not scale below X nanometers. Of course, when they publish their report, they don't say X, they have a number over there, but they keep changing that number. So I don't want to keep my slide coherent with their number. That's why the value X is there. We're going to talk about that number in a little bit. But clearly, reducing the size of a component provides many benefits. It gives you the higher capacity that these things are designed for. It gives you a lower cost per bit. It gives you a lower energy, although that's debatable going forward. But basically, if this ends, then we have a problem, basically. We're not going to be able to satisfy these requirements on top. So these are actually interrelated with each other somehow. So let me talk about the DRAM scaling problem a little bit more. Basically, if you look at DRAM, actually any memory is very all types of memory are very similar to each other, in my opinion. I've been looking at a lot of these things. When the memory scales, you'll have problems in the end. For any memory to work, you need to have a storage device, and then you need to have an access device. In DRAM, the storage device is the capacitor, and the access device is the access transistor, the bit line, and the sense amplifiers, all of the peripheral circuitry that goes around it. For the storage device to work, the capacitor must be large enough for reliable sensing. For the access device to work, the access transistor should be large enough for low leakage and high retention time. And you should not be vulnerable to too much noise, basically, in this device. So this was the value that was assigned to X by ITRS in 2009. They said reducing the feature size of a DRAM cell below 35 nanometers is challenging. They didn't say it's impossible. They said it's challenging. Does anybody here know what's the feature size of a state-of-the-art DRAM cell is today? Any guesses? 7-ish. I heard 7-ish. That's very optimistic. That was the best value that I got. When I give talks at these 3 major DRAM manufacturers, I usually ask, what is the minimum feature size do you think DRAM will scale to? And usually the engineers are conservative. They say 10. I've heard 7 from one person, and I think everybody laughed when they heard the 7. But clearly we're not at 7 today. Today we're around 17. But clearly we're below 35. So it was challenging. So these folks were not wrong. It was challenging. And I'm going to give you evidence from the field that they were not wrong in a little bit. Basically, as you reduce the size of the cell, both of these properties become difficult to maintain. The capacitor becomes smaller and more vulnerable to noise. The access transistor also becomes smaller, becomes more leaky, and becomes more vulnerable to noise. As a result, it becomes very difficult to scale the size of a DRAM cell. And if you're looking at this picture like this, but they don't lay out these things like this. If you actually look at the capacitor is actually like this. You actually carve, it's almost 3-dimensional basically. It's not a 3-dimensional circuit, but you basically carve something huge inside the silicon over there. Okay, anyway, so basically, these are it becomes difficult to place and control charge when you have DRAM. When you need to deal with charge, when you store data with charge. This is true for flash memory also, actually. Clearly it's true for DRAM. Basically, reliable sensing becomes difficult as charge storage unit size reduces. Let me very briefly talk about flash memory. Flash memory has essentially the same problem because it basically traps charge in this floating gate. And until very recently, like 4 or 5 years ago, flash memory had a big scaling problem. Actually, maybe not 4 or 5 years ago, 3 years ago. Flash memory had a big scaling problem because the number of electrons that you could store in this floating gate became smaller and smaller as you reduce the size of its cell. And as a result, you ran into a lot of reliability issues that I will very briefly talk about later on. And it was it was hitting the scaling limit before DRAM. But what happened with flash memory is, again, another technological change. The manufacturers figured out how to string flash cells in a 3-dimensional manner. As opposed to going planar, and trying to reduce the size of a flash cell as much as possible. Now they actually strung together flash cells vertically. Now actually manufacturers have, I think, 128 layer chips. Now what they did was they increased the flash cell size, and they kept adding more layers. So they went from about, let's say, 12 nanometers to 40 nanometers. So they actually scaled up the cell size, but they still gained capacity. So that's the kind of technological change that would be useful, but it's very difficult to get in DRAM as far as I know. Okay, so as memory scales, it becomes unreliable actually. There's evidence from the field showing that. This is actually a study that we did with Facebook. One of my students went to Facebook, did an internship, and he's still at Facebook actually after that. But basically, we studied the correlation between the chip density that's employed in a server and the failure rate of the server. And you can see this correlation over here. As chip density increases, so server failure rate increases. Now, I'm not going to go into the definition of the server failure rate. You should really look at the paper for more, because clearly you're not comparing the same servers when you do this, right? These are different servers. But you can take a look at the paper for more detail. And the intuition is that basically these chips that are higher density, the cells are closer to each other, and they're much more vulnerable to noise, and there are a lot of different types of noise that is affecting the DRAM. And if you're interested, you can read our DSN paper that talks about this. And we've been doing, so this is a very large-scale experiment, clearly. We look at all of the memory that's in, actually, when we studied this, we had records, we collected records from memory errors that happened at Facebook over the course of 1.5 years. And this is all of their servers. They have a very good recording system. This is all of their servers. So we got a lot of data over there. But of course, this is not a controlled study, right? Basically, we cannot control what's happening. This is production servers that are running, and we just look at what happens to the servers when they get memory errors. But we wanted to actually control things also. So much before we did that study with Facebook, we started building our infrastructure. It's an FPGA-based infrastructure where you connect DRAMs to FPGAs, and you can basically test the DRAMs. And we've been looking at a lot of issues in DRAM to understand this. I'm going to talk about this infrastructure later on. We call this soft MC, soft memory controller. It's essentially a memory tester. And we actually made it easy for people to do these studies. It's relatively flexible. You have a C++ API. You don't even need to know Verilog to actually do this, because we hide it under a C++ API. You can actually take this. Do you have a question? Or okay, you're just stretching. You can actually take this and do a lot of the studies that I'm going to describe in a little bit. And this is open source. We're happy to support it. And I think a lot of people are starting to use it for doing interesting experiments in DRAM. And that's the paper associated with it. Okay, so while we were doing these studies, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail. You mentioned rowhammer. But we basically stumbled upon errors in DRAM that should not otherwise happen, basically. And basically, this is the fact that you can predictably induce errors in most DRAM memory chips today. I'm going to go into detail of this later on, but this is called rowhammer, and it's a simple hardware failure mechanism that can create a widespread system security vulnerability because you can predictably flip a bit. If you know you can flip a bit, you can flip it again and again and again. You can discover bits that you can flip in memory. And this is really happening because cells are too close to each other in DRAM today. And I liked some of these papers that build on it. Basically, these folks at Wired said, forget software, now hackers are exploiting physics. And that's really the gist of the problem, I think. Okay, I'm going to talk about this later on, so I'm not going to spend time on this. But we wrote this paper recently that covers a lot of the research that happened on rowhammer until recently. Although there's more research that is coming out right now that doesn't get covered over here. I'm going to talk about this paper later on, perhaps. But basically, I was invited to give a talk at the International Memory Workshop, which is actually a very heavily industry-dominated workshop. In 2013, and this was they asked me to write a paper, and I said, okay, I'm going to write this paper. And at this point, we didn't have any evidence of, well, I guess we did have some evidence of rowhammer, but we didn't publish it at that time. So a lot of the memory scaling issues that I'm going to talk about in a little bit are based on this paper, but we have discovered even more with the infrastructure that we built going forward. Okay, so let me pull back a little bit. So DRAM scaling has already become increasingly difficult, and there are many reasons for it. And the previous papers actually talk about that. I'm not going to talk about that anymore, at least in this part of the lecture. It's difficult to significantly improve capacity and energy. And one of the, as a result, there are a bunch of emerging memory technologies. And I think some of them are DRAM-based, some of them are not DRAM-based. 3D stacked DRAM is one example. It has an upside. Reduced latency DRAM is another example, although it's not emerging, I should say. It exists, but I think low-cost reduced latency DRAM is emerging. Low-power DRAM is another example. It's been around, and I think there are benefits to it. And non-volatile memory, there are many different types of non-volatile memory. There are benefits to it also. And again, I picked the most salient benefit over here. There may be other benefits. Clearly, non-volatility is a benefit over here, right? But of course, all of these memory technologies are not perfect. They come with reds as well. So we're left with this picture where there's no perfect memory. There's no memory that's green at every single metric that we want it to be green at, right? All of the memories are a trade-off, basically. They have greens and reds. And as a result, people are moving into this direction where they're designing hybrid memory systems. They're attaching different types of memories that have different kinds of greens and different types of reds. And then the burden goes into the hardware and software. How do you design the hardware and software to manage the data allocation and movement to achieve the greens as much as possible while avoiding the reds as much as possible? So DRAM and phase change memory is one example of this. But it could be high bandwidth DRAM like HBM, or high bandwidth, high cost, high energy, low capacity DRAM, plus low bandwidth, low cost, low energy, and high capacity DRAM over here, right? And then how do you manage these different technologies, right? And I think this is a very good way of scaling memory into the future, but of course it comes at the cost of managing the heterogeneity that comes with it. Okay, so I think this is going to be my first foreshadowing. If you really want to have a system like this to scale up the memory, then I think you really need to have an intelligent memory controller that understands what's going on in the system, because there are a lot of design decisions that you need to make over here. First of all, how do you use DRAM? Is the cache or is it programmer managed? Regardless of whoever manages it, somebody needs to make the decision that what goes into DRAM. If it's the controller that's making that decision, the controller needs to be intelligent. If it's the programmer making that decision, the programmer needs to have information from somewhere, and they could benefit from an intelligent controller. So there are many, many issues over here, I think. And I think hybrid memory is one reason why we want to have intelligent controllers. I'm not going to talk about hybrid memory a lot in these lecture series, but it's a fascinating area also. Okay, we're talking about scaling. Industry is actually writing papers about these scaling challenges also. This is a paper that I like a lot because it's written by two companies that don't talk to each other, Samsung and Intel. I think life would be better for everyone if they talk to each other, but they don't talk to each other. But basically, they were nice enough to write this position paper, I will call it, to the memory forum that we organized in 2014. And they basically talked about the scaling challenges that they're facing. And refresh is a big problem. Write latencies are increasing. They're already increasing, actually. Refresh also increased. Refresh rates are already increasing. And variable retention time is a problem also. Basically, they also argued that intelligent memory controllers would be useful. While at the same time, we were arguing it. Although we'll see how much of this is going to happen into the future. Industry usually moves much slowly. Paolo's laughing at me over there. Okay. Any questions? Am I going too fast or too slow? Too fast? It's okay? Okay. I can go faster. I can go slower also, but okay. So we're still going through the trends in memory, basically. I think the other issue that is orthogonal to everything else we talked about is memory interference. And I think this is also very fundamental. Whenever you have memory as a shared medium across multiple applications, you have an interference problem. And I think memory is becoming a much bigger shared medium. I think storage is going to become an even bigger shared medium than it is today, going into the future also. And when they merge, they will become together a shared medium. But basically, applications or cores interfere with each other when they access this shared main memory. And if you don't control this interference somehow, this leads to many problems. Quality of service problems, performance problems, and eventually energy problems also. Because if you delay one application forever, you have a problem with energy in the end. Because at some point, you will need to service only that application in your system, depending on your system model, of course. So basically, one goal that is important, I think, is having predictable performance in complex systems, because memory is actually getting more complex, as we discussed. Systems are getting more complex. There's a lot of heterogeneity over here. This picture doesn't do justice to it. You have heterogeneous agents, you have heterogeneous memories, and you need to have intelligent controllers. The question is, how do you design these controllers to allocate resources to these heterogeneous agents to mitigate interference and provide predictable performance? And this system is actually much more complicated than what I've shown over here. Maybe it doesn't have the hybrid memory at this point, but it's going to have it soon. So I think this is my other foreshadowing. If you actually are building a controller like this, the controller is really the center of the world over here because everything goes through the controller to access data. And you probably want to make that intelligent. Okay, so let me talk about some broad solution directions before we go into the second part. I call this how do you solve the memory problem. And I think there are at least three directions. One is somehow, as I've been pointing out, we should fix the memory, make the memory and the controllers more intelligent. I think this comes with new interfaces, new functions, and new approaches, new architectures, basically, to memory. Basically, memory has been viewed as a component that's designed on its own for a really long time. And it's actually viewed as a dumb component. Dumb meaning, basically, it cannot do anything other than store data, right? It cannot even move data internally. Somebody has to tell it to do something to the data, right? Basically, maybe we should really rethink that design and co-design the system and the memory together. Okay. Or maybe we eliminate this memory problem or minimize it. Basically come up with some technology that doesn't have all of these problems that we've discussed. I think it's going to be very difficult in the end, but maybe we can alleviate some of the issues by going into hybrid memory systems. Somehow we can augment DRAM with a different technology. I think replacing is going to be very difficult. Maybe in a very long term, it's possible. So I think this is good because this can enable new technologies and system-wide rethinking of memory and storage because some of these new memory technologies are non-volatile, and you could use them as both memory and storage. Okay, or another direction I think is really embracing the problem as much as we can, whenever we can. Basically design heterogeneous memories, none of which are perfect, and map data intelligently across them. So this can enable us to deal with new models for data management and maybe use. So what is the idea? Basically, most of your memory could be not perfect, right? Maybe you have all of these vulnerabilities in most of your memory, but if you understand your data, you don't map your important data to that memory. You map your important data to the expensive, small memory that doesn't have the problems, right? That you keep refreshing very frequently, for example, right? That has a lot of error correcting codes. I think this is a very good direction also. Maybe there are other solutions. But I think these solutions to memory scaling require software, hardware, and device cooperation. And we need to really think across the stack. And I think these lectures are going to be about that thinking across the stack somehow. Okay, so let me give broad overviews of these directions, and then we will conclude this first part after we talk about memory controls a little bit. So what is the first solution direction is new memory architectures. We'd like to overcome memory shortcomings with more memory-centric system design, as opposed to memory being something designed on its own and ignored. We want novel memory architectures, new interfaces, new functions, and I think we want also better waste management. Today, actually, we're wasting memory quite a bit. We put a lot of memory, but we're not using it very efficiently. So, for example, both at the higher levels as well as the lower levels. For example, at the lower levels, people have shown that you're storing zeros in 30% of your memory. That's not very good, right? So there are many key issues to tackle over here, and we're going to talk about a bunch of them. How do we enable reliability at low cost? How do we get high capacity that way? How do we reduce energy? How do we reduce latency? How do we improve bandwidth? How do we reduce waste in terms of capacity, bandwidth, and latency? And I think in the end, how do we enable computation close to data? Because if you actually do computation close to data, you can get rid of a lot of these issues relatively quickly. And I'm going to talk about some of these papers that we've been writing. The second solution direction is emerging memory technologies. I think this is fascinating. I'm not going to talk about this as much, but keep this in mind because a lot of the things that we're going to talk about within the context of DRAM is going to be applicable to emerging memory technologies also. And I'm going to point out some of these things. There are some emerging memory technologies that are resistive. They're not charge-based. As a result, they're much more scalable than DRAM because they don't need to deal with charge. They're dealing with resistance. They have some other reliability issues, but the scalability is not a big problem. And they're also non-volatile. One example is phase change memory, and we've been working with phase change memory for a long time. Here, the data is stored by changing the phase of a material, and data is read by detecting material's resistance. So a material exists in two states, amorphous and crystalline, and you basically apply high current or different types of current to actually move the state from amorphous to crystalline and crystalline to amorphous. This is actually really old technology, by the way. This is designed in 1960s, phase change memory. It's used in rewritable CDs. In rewritable CDs, you take advantage of the fact that the different phases of the material have different optical reflexivities. Basically, you shine light on it, and you get different refractions, and as a result, you know what data you've stored. But that's a very slow reading process. So what happened recently that made this very interesting as main memory is some folks invested a lot into designing the read device. So the storage device is this phase change material. Read device is how do you actually do the reading out of that material. If you do the reading optically, forget about it. It's not going to be your main memory. It's going to be your rewritable disk, maybe, yes. If you do the reading in some other way, and Intel and IBM actually get a lot of credit, I think, in terms of developing these sensing devices. I'm not going to go into that clearly, and that's not my expertise area also. But basically, what they've done is they reduced the latency of reading significantly with these read devices. As a result, it became very interesting for existing systems. And these are old numbers. So if you're really interested in the technology, I would recommend this paper from IBM Journal of Research and Development that basically shows that shows the properties of the phase change memory, and they prototyped it at 20 nanometers as early as 2008. Today in DRAM, we're at 17 nanometers right now. So it's projected to scale to actually, I think, 2 nanometers today. The latest things say 2 nanometers. Although I'm not sure, I haven't seen any device that has 2 nanometers. And it's expected to be denser than DRAM because you can store multiple bits per cell. This is just like flash. So it's very difficult to store multiple bits per cell in DRAM because, well, you could, but you need to have a very good sense amplifier, which is extremely expensive. But there are a lot of reliability issues. But with these memories, because the resistance range is very large, you can chop up the resistance range to multiple different values, essentially. And you can actually encode 2 bits per cell, 3 bits per cell, 4 bits per cell, just like flash. In flash, we're actually already at QLC, right, which is 4 bits per cell. Okay, but the problem is, as good as they sound, these emerging memory technologies have many shortcomings. The key question is, can we somehow enable them to replace, augment, and surpass DRAM? I'm not going to talk about these, but we do a lot of work in this area, and I think there's going to be a lot more work. And if you're interested, this is one of the papers that we've written in 2009. At the time we wrote this paper, there were 2 other papers in the same session. People were very interested in phase change memory. And we were saying, why don't you replace DRAM? And we did a lot of analysis. And if you're interested, this is a shorter version of that paper. But the good thing is these are happening right now, basically. The ideas were there much earlier, clearly, but in 2009, you could buy this device. Maybe not in the same way you would like it to be, but it's a DIMM, and you can actually use it. I believe it's PCM, even though Intel never admits that it's PCM. The evidence suggests that it's probably PCM. But these things exist, so you can actually use them in your systems. And I'm going to leave it at that. But maybe using this as the only memory in your system is not a good idea because it's not fast, it's not high bandwidth as DRAM, as fast or as high bandwidth as DRAM. It's much better than flash in some dimensions. Okay, so as I said, it may be better to actually have a hybrid memory system and design the hardware and software to manage the data allocation and movement such that you can exercise the greens of different technologies while avoiding the reds as much as possible. I'll give you one example of this, and this is work that we've done with Microsoft, actually. If you have this hybrid memory, if you want to scale memory, maybe you actually want to take advantage of the characteristics of an application in terms of its tolerance to memory error vulnerability. So in an application, you may have different data. If you get a bit flip in some data, your system crashes. This may be an important pointer-based data structure, for example. Or you get completely nonsense results. If you have a bit flip on some other data, you don't care because this is at a precision level that you don't care about, right? If you can characterize these different vulnerabilities to errors somehow, I'm not telling you how. In this case, my student did it by hand. That's a good starting point. And I think some programmers will do it. You can say vulnerable and tolerant, and you can map your vulnerable and tolerant to different types of memories. You can design this reliable memory to be extremely reliable. You can design this tolerant memory to be as low cost as you want while guaranteeing some sort of quality, meaning error rate. And again, I'm not going to go into the design space. We call this heterogeneous reliability memory. And we actually did this with Microsoft on a bunch of workloads. Graph processing was one of them. Graph processing didn't work out really well. But on the web search workload, actually, we showed that you can get rid of ECC from the data center for most of your data center and reduce hardware costs significantly and energy correspondingly significantly. And you can achieve single server availability that's reasonable, that you can tolerate at the higher levels of the system stack. Okay, so this is basically the high level. You have different applications, and you somehow characterize and classify application memory error tolerance at some granularity. I think within an application, do you go into the data structure granularity is a good question also. And you basically have different shades of gray, let's say, in terms of vulnerability and tolerance to errors. in the previous one, we had black and white. And then you map the application data to the heterogeneous reliability memory system. And somehow, of course, this is a hardware-software co-design. This cannot be just hardware or software purely. And you can see the paper for the different, and there's a continuum between the reliable memory and unreliable memory, depending on what kind of error rate that you can tolerate. Right? We're going to get back to this, actually, when we talk about low latency, because you can reduce latency by, and also improve energy by making memory less reliable. And also you can make it low cost. So actually, reduced latency memory can be very low cost if you get rid of the reliability requirement. And you can actually, if you can tolerate it at the higher levels, it falls off somewhere over here, basically. Okay, and I'm not going to bore you with these details, but these are in the paper over here. Okay. So memory interference, I think we've talked about it briefly, but basically, we want to control it. Today, it's mostly uncontrolled, in my opinion, although there are attempts at controlling it. And if you don't control it, you essentially have an uncontrollable, unpredictable, vulnerable system, right? You may want to co-locate multiple applications at the higher levels of the system stack, but when you co-locate them, the memory controller prioritizes only one of them, right? That sounds very bad, I think. Then you cannot guarantee anything about this. The solution that we're pursuing is quality of service aware memory systems. In this case, again, it's a hardware-software cooperative solution. Hardware is designed to provide a configurable fairness substrate to the software. Basically, you have knobs that you can play with to do application-aware memory scheduling, partitioning, and throttling. And the software is designed to configure these resources to satisfy different quality of service goals for different applications and for different system modes also, or users. And I think this is a good direction. There's been a lot of work in this area. I'm going to briefly gloss over a lot of them, and I'm not going to talk about this in more detail than what I have over here. Basically, we would like to be stronger when we actually do this. We want to satisfy some performance and system service level agreement requirements in the presence of memory, shared main memory, heterogeneous agents, and hybrid memory and storage. And one of the approaches that we've been taking is somehow modeling how much you have lost performance because you're doing your resources being shared with some other application. Basically, you're running multiple applications together. Having a model that tells you the slowdown of each application compared to when it's run alone on the same system or compared to some reference system would be very useful, because that way you can have an idea of how much you're slowing down each application. And then you can actually, this is one part of the story. Of course, you have this model that tells you the slowdowns, and you feed it to some mechanisms that you have in hardware and software that basically partition and prioritize the different applications such that you can achieve the performance levels of different applications. I think partitioning the problem this way is very interesting, and we've been doing some work in this area. But of course, the difficulty is this. While you want to provide high system performance while doing this. Because if this is not a requirement, the problem is really easy, right? You design a 1,000-core machine, you just run one application in one core, and everything is guaranteed for that machine. Okay, I'd be happy to talk about this in more detail. Again, I'm going to skip some of these things, but DRAM controls are very interesting. This is based on, since we're not going to talk about quality of service, I just put some slides over here talking about the DRAM controllers, and I'd be happy to talk about it because I think this is really fascinating. My fascination with DRAM controllers started when I was an intern at Intel, actually. We were looking at front-side bus controllers at that point. At that point, memory controller was off-chip. You had this front-side bus controller, and memory controller had its own chip, actually. It was a Northbridge chip. And what happened was you would do scheduling in both sides. In the memory controller, you had some scheduling. It was not very sophisticated. In the front-side bus, you had some scheduling. And the goal was to actually provide some sort of predictability by sending the requests in a good order from the front-side bus to the main memory. And later, of course, AMD came up and put the memory controller on chip, and Intel had to follow suit because they had to reduce the latencies in a similar way. The problem became easier. So integration actually allowed us to do a lot more things, as you see over here. But we've shown that you can actually cause memory performance attacks if you actually have an unfair scheduler in your memory. And we basically tried to solve the problem. Again, I'm not going to bore you with these. These are very, very interesting for me. And I'll talk about reuse later on, perhaps, if we have time. But if you're interested, I'd be happy to talk about it. And I think the problem is getting worse, as I said, because the systems are getting more complex and the memory is getting more complex. And a memory controller is really the center of the world in a system like this. Everything goes through the memory controller. Your DMA engine goes through the memory controller. Your storage goes through the memory controller. Whatever you imagine, your network goes through the memory controller also, actually. Okay. Well, yeah, this is, I think, this is the slide that I was looking for. It's getting more complex, basically. And the goals and many constraints and the metrics are also increasing. And I think this is, I usually don't like throwing machine learning as a solution to this problem, but in this case, I think it's a good idea to think about machine learning. Because we've done a lot of work on memory controllers. I don't know if you have time for stories anymore, but I'll give you one more story. But basically, this work came about because we were really designing memory controllers while I joined when I was at Microsoft Research, and we were designing these memory controllers, and it was to provide quality of service and performance at the same time. It was not easy because there are many constraints. We're going to hopefully get back to this, but I'm not sure if we are going to get to it given the amount of time I'm spending on these slides. But basically, it's not easy to design these controllers. And the story that I was going to give you was, who knows about Chuck Tacker here? Okay, nobody. So Chuck Tacker, who knows about the Xerox Alto system? These are early personal computers. Some people know probably. These are some early personal computers. He was one of the chief architects of the Xerox Alto system. He's a very system-level person. He got the Turing Award in 2009. So he was a technical fellow of Microsoft Research, and we used to talk a lot. At that time, he was designing a DDR3 memory controller for the Berkeley emulation engine, the FPGA that they had. And he said, this is the worst thing I've ever designed in my life. and that this person designed very complex things in the 1960s. Right? Well, you cannot say that it was because he was old, because he was very sharp even when he was old. But basically, these are actually really bad things to design, and hopefully I'll get back to this. And there are many dimensions, and I think it's not humanly possible to think of all of these dimensions to actually really optimize the system. This is where machine learning can help. And this was actually a paper that we published about, I guess, 11 years ago now, where we applied the reinforcement learning principles to memory control and showed that you can design a much simpler memory control, simpler for the designer themselves, and higher performance memory control at the same time by taking advantage of machine learning. I think this is a very good direction to follow. Hopefully we'll get back to this. And I believe that in the future there will be many new problems in memory controllers. But I think all of them point to intelligence somehow. Okay. So now that we've finished the prologue, which took a long time, let's talk about what we will cover in the lectures themselves. So this is what I intend to cover, but we don't have to cover. We can do out-of-order scheduling also, depending on people's interests. Basically, I think I'm almost done with this one. I'm going to cover a scaling issue with memory that motivates intelligent controllers further, which is the row hammer problem, if people are interested. Maybe I'll take a vote after this. And then I'll cover in-memory computation, and then low latency memory. This is going to be shorter, of course, and data-driven and data-aware architectures, which, so I think of these as data-centric architectures, but there are also other things that we should really think about data when we're actually designing a better architecture. And then hopefully draw some guiding principles and conclusion. Does this order sound good, or should we do out-of-order scheduling, or should we get rid of some part? Any takers?
I have one general comment. And
sure.
I suspect you're going to cover it all over, but I
sure.
just wanted to make it. And I made a number of notes when you talk about intelligent controllers. And,
sure.
While we can write data that's going to end up being managed by different controllers, then you can write data. You could technically decide how fast you wanted the data to write,
sure.
or you could actually decide how reliable
absolutely.
you wanted the data to write, and you could decide that you wanted the write to be predictable. So you're coming up with all these properties that are being possible, and you're talking about systems that will take a mix of those properties and try to satisfy some service level agreement of some sort. My question is, do these things ever get to be decided by the programmer? Is there ever a point where we're talking about intelligence, but does intelligence will come with programmability?
I see.
At which level this programmability should happen? And just to finish the question, back in the day, remember in C++, you can actually say, I want this thing to be in a register.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
These days you cannot make this decision anymore. You can say, I do not want this thing to be in a register. That's basically what you can do.
Yeah.
And then everything in the memory stack, but everything from that point on is transparent, with the sole exception recently that maybe you're going to be asked when to flush a cache line. Right? Is programmability going to come in this equation? Because like we want to have a say in this as well.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, hopefully we'll cover that more when we talk about in-memory computation. But I think programmability is really important. I think programmer needs to decide a bunch of things. I'll give you some data from our own experiments showing that if a programmer does some things, you will get a lot more performance and a lot more energy efficiency. So I believe it needs to be done, as long as, of course, the programmer knows what they're doing, right?
I mean, that's the point. I don't think it should be done everywhere, because
sure.
Sometimes you just want to, I want to increment this variable.
Exactly.
Don't ask me 45 questions about
exactly.
how you want the result to be. But people designing low-level systems, operating systems, database systems, compilers, they might, and I read some of this literature, I'm learning a lot here today, but I don't see the programmability in the discussion.
Yeah. So we will talk about that. That's certainly an adoption challenge. And I think people who can do these, do the programming, they will use it. But I think programmers should be involved for sure. Okay. Okay, maybe. So I actually give this as a longer course also sometimes. That's why these slides are here. But let me quickly cover it, I guess, because there could be something useful here. Basically, I think we'll cover many problems related to design of memory systems. How many people are PhD students here? Okay, that's good. How many people are master's students? How many people are professors or, okay? Anybody else? Researchers? Okay, so we have a healthy mix over here. That's great. Okay, so this is what I use to motivate people into computer architecture sometimes. Basically, the design of the memory system poses, I think, many difficult research and engineering problems, important fundamental problems, and industry-relevant problems. I think this is really important. And I believe, actually, I'm not exaggerating here, problems whose solutions can revolutionize the world. And I believe sometimes the problems can revolutionize the world also. If you discover a new problem in the memory system, it could actually affect a lot of things, because DRAM is everywhere, basically. Well, storage everywhere also, and those are part of the memory system. And I think we really need many creative, insightful solutions to solve these problems. And hopefully this course will help with what is over here, but clearly we don't have enough time to cover 22 hours or 25 hours. Basically, hopefully this will help you acquire the basics to develop such solutions. But I'll go through it relatively quickly. So these are some suggestions, but I think they're not applicable to a shorter course. But I like this quote from Pasteur. It says, "Chance favors a prepared mind." Okay, so unfortunately, there's a lot more in the memory system that we're not going to talk about. I think it's always good to talk about what we're not going to talk about also. And that's interference and quality of service. I think that's extremely important, but we just don't have time, which is related to predictable performance. Okay, this is a mind of its own. Emerging memory technologies, as I said, and cache management and interconnects. Believe it or not, caches will not be useless if you actually go to in-memory computation, because you want to exploit locality over there too. There's no way you can design a huge monolithic memory or storage array that's going to be low latency enough that could compete with a small cache in the end. So you will need to have some caches in when you have in-memory computation, in my opinion. Or otherwise, you need to have extremely high levels of parallelism to overlap the latency. But in my opinion, most algorithms don't have that extreme high levels of parallelism. In the end, you have some serial bottleneck somewhere that your cache will help with. Okay, interconnects, I think, are going to be even more important, because if you actually think about it, there was this debate in HPCA, I think, in 2002, and the question was, is it the memory or is it the interconnect? And people were arguing on different sides, and you can guess who was arguing what. Some people were arguing memory is important, some people were arguing interconnect is important. If you ask me that question, it's the same problem, basically. In the end, it's about communication and data movement, and if you look at the energy cost of main memory, it's mostly interconnect. And the reason we have this huge disparity between the energy cost of computation versus energy cost of memory is we were able to scale the size, latency, and energy of a transistor, which is logic, but we were not able to scale the interconnect. That's why memory is really interconnect in the end. And interconnect may or may not be memory. So in a sense, interconnect may be more fundamental, but we can argue that. Okay, I'm going to skip this one. So we're going to talk about some challenges in DRAM scaling, and I'm going to move to that one now. Okay, I guess before we talk about it, I should probably put a plug out to our memory simulator also, because some of you may be interested in going into memory research. So we're going to talk about rove hammering a little bit. But keep in mind there are multiple evaluation methods. Rove hammering was evaluated in a real system. But some of the ideas you need to evaluate in simulation, because there's no way you can evaluate them in a real system. Or the real system that you want to evaluate it will take years to build. but you really want to explore the ideas speculatively. So we've been designing a lot of simulators also, and this is a simulator that is developed starting from when I joined Microsoft Research in 2006. We eventually open sourced it in 2015. My students made it much, much better, of course. When I started Microsoft Research, we wrote in C# because my colleague wanted to do it in C#. I said, okay, I can do C#, but it was extremely slow. We needed it in C#. And now it's evolved. We have a C# version that's also public. We have a C++ version that's also public. And it's used a lot in academia and industry. Actually, a lot of industry partners give us feedback, and we improve the simulator over time. But basically, this simulator was motivated by the fact that what I described earlier, DRAM and memory control landscape is changing, and there are many new ideas that we want to experiment with. And we want to have a fast and easy to extend simulator to actually experiment with all of these ideas. And this is the DRAM landscape at the time we wrote the paper, basically. You have different types of DRAM, and there are a lot of academic proposals. So what does the emulator do? Basically, it's a memory simulator. You can integrate it with other system simulators. You can write your own simulator around it. But the core of it is it's a really DRAM simulator. It provides out-of-the-box support for many DRAM standards. You can see all of those over here. And I'm going to talk about some of the studies that we've done. It's faster than the fastest open source simulator that existed. And it's also modular and extensible to different standards. So people have actually used it to do non-volatile memories, for example, if you're interested in that route. So you can do studies like this relatively easily, which were not really easy to do in the past. So basically, you can compare different standards, DDR3, wide I/O, LPDDR, which one performs better on the workload set that you're really interested in examining, and you can plot things like this. And you can find out, for example, that, for example, your low-power DDR memory is not performing as well as your DDR3, as expected. And you can find out that your high-bandwidth memory is performing 27% on average better than your DDR3 baseline. We're going to get back to this, but I think this sort of simulation infrastructure that's relatively fast and flexible is going to be really important. I wish we had this at the system level, but system-level simulators tend to be more complex. If you're interested, we're really happy to support it. We're actually working with a lot of folks to improve the simulator. It has a, yes?
Is it extensible to 3D exploit?
Yes, absolutely. So you can actually, as long as you know the parameters of your memory, you can extend it relatively easily. And other people have extended to MRAM, for example, which is not exact 3D exploit, but some sort of non-volatile memory. So if you're interested in the infrastructure, we're happy to support it. That's true for SoftMC also, but the barrier to entry in SoftMC is, of course, harder because you need to get an FPGA. We don't provide the FPGA, unfortunately. Okay. And I think this is a good way of also getting started in memory systems research. This is what I recommend for the longer course when people take it, basically. They can easily get into memory system research by actually trying to play with the simulator. Okay, and that's the end of part 1.